Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. If you utilize samples in your music and find that they're sounding a little sameish and lacking sonic variety, I put together this video to offer a few different techniques that we can use to add that sonic variety to our samples. So without further ado, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and have a look at these tips. All right, here we are inside of Logic to talk about giving more sonic variation to our samples. I'm going to keep things pretty simple for this video and just work on a snare drum and a hi-hat. I have the snare drum loaded into just the stock Q sampler, the quick sampler from Logic Pro, although you can use whatever sampler you would like. And then I have the hat just as samples within the arrangement view right here. So what I'm going to teach here will apply to whatever samples you happen to be using, whether you are using percussion samples like this, or you happen to be using different vocal samples, different instrument samples. I just chose percussion samples because they are very repetitive. It's often the case personally that if I'm using a vocal sample, let's say, or maybe a full band sample from a record, that I will want to maybe affect it with certain effects, but I don't really need it to evolve that much, versus when I'm using percussion samples or if I'm using a virtual instrument, let's say, I do want that variation so that it's not sounding so robotic, so sameish. So again, I've got a snare going through a sampler and I've got a hi-hat just as samples in this arrangement view. So the first technique I have for you is to alter the time, expansion, and compression of the samples. So this is most easily done on samples when they are inside the arrangement view. So for example, in Logic Pro, if I zoom in here, I can hold down the Option key and stretch out or expand my samples or make them smaller and compress them. So if I was to compress all of these, it's actually compressing the samples of this digital audio file. And so it's pressing information into fewer and fewer samples. And so it will alter the sound of the hit. Now that was pretty compressed. If I undo that, I can also go the other way by expanding them. Now, the fun comes in when we actually treat each sample individually. And so for example, I could hold down Option, make this one a little bit expanded, make this one a little bit compressed, and just go through and alter them ever so slightly just to give a little bit of variation. So like that, and then I can even make things shorter, even though there's not a whole lot of information at the tail end of the sample. This will give me a different look when I am expanding and compressing. So let's just go through and do a little bit here. Make sure I'm hitting the right hotkeys and grabbing at the right spots in the actual audio right here. I have to go to the bottom to actually expand. And just go through and do a little something like this. And I'm just doing this haphazardly. There's no rhyme or reason right here. I just want to change them up a little bit so that we have some differences between each time that hi-hat hits. And so actually before I get to that, I'm gonna leave this one as it is normal. I'm going to duplicate this track so that we can get a nice A/B test here. I'm just going to paste this sample along here, like so. So here's what we have with the same sample every time in terms of the hat. So the same snare, the same hat every time, and then with a little bit of compression and expansion on the hat sample, we have something like this. So just a little bit of variation just to give a little bit more movement to those hats. We can do something similar, although we can't do the exact same in the sampler, by actually going to the envelope down here. And I can, as the snare is playing, move this around and even automate it. So I'll actually automate it just to show you. We have the amp envelope right here, but I'm actually going to go down to latch so that whatever I grab right here, that is what will be automated in real time. And so we can go back to the start right here and I'll automate this. So I really axed down on the sustain right there. If I go to the actual decay, sorry, not the sustain, and then I can finesse this after the fact if I would like to. So that is much more intense than the simple expansion and compression I did to the hat. There's a lot more variation, but it is similar to what I was doing, just to give a little bit of variation. give a little bit of variation to that snare, as well as having that variation in the hat. Technique number 2 I have for you now is more easily achieved with a sampler than it is with samples laid out in the arrangement view, and that is to alter the velocity. And so I have this instrument 1, or the snare, selected right here, and I can go in, select all of these, and I have some different things I can do. I can quantize, I can go up here and do a few different functions in the MIDI transform, which is a whole can of worms to open up. But the one I want to focus on is actually changing the velocity or the levels of the hits. And so I can go in and randomly change these velocities by clicking on them and just altering the velocity slightly. I don't want to go too far one way or the other to really make huge differences in the velocity, but I do want little changes. So what I can actually do here is go Functions, MIDI Transform, and in Logic, we have a bunch of different things to choose from, but I can go to Humanize. And I think that most digital audio workstations have something similar to this. And we have some randomization that we can do here. So I don't want to randomize any of the length. I also don't want to randomize any operations right here, but I do want to randomize some of the velocity, and I want to go plus or minus about, say, 5 along the 0 to 127. So I can then go Operate Only, and you see that it changed the velocities ever so slightly down here. So rather than having them all at 80, this one's at 84, for example, this one's at 77, this one's at 83, plus or minus from that original 80 starting point. And now we have a little bit of sonic variation in terms of velocity or level. That's good. And then we can also go to our hats and actually adjust the gain of the samples themselves. And so maybe I want each downbeat to be a little bit louder, so I can start coarsely from here. Select all of these and go to this section in Logic Pro and go to gain. Maybe I'll turn those down by 3 dB. Have a listen to what that sounds like just off the top. And then maybe I want these upbeats to be a little bit louder, so I'll bring those up to, say, -1.5. Not as random as I did with the snare, but it does add a little bit of difference to the overall sound of these samples. The next technique I have for you is pitch shifting. Again, this is fairly easy to do in samplers, where we can actually go to the piano roll and change the notes. However, this might be a little bit too much. Let's have a listen to this. It may sound really pitch shifted, and there are other ways of doing this that I will get to in a moment, but just to have a listen here quickly. So that sounds way too much like it's coming from a sampler and it's actually being pitched. So let's bring these all the way back down to the root key. And we'll actually open up the sampler right here, and we can automate the fine pitch rather than the coarse pitch. So the coarse pitch is the semitones, so much like we were just doing in the piano roll. Rather, I can automate the fine pitch. So if I click on the arrangement view, hit A, I'm still on latch mode, so whatever I click on and move about will actually change as I play through. So we can start from the beginning, and I can just modulate the pitch a little bit. So it may be a little bit too much jumping from +18 to -18. Let's listen back. Yeah, that's a little bit too much for my liking. And this could mimic just hitting different spots on an actual snare drum. Again, a little bit of sonic variation there. And then in terms of the actual samples that are laid out, I can get out of my automation, click on one of these, and I actually have transpose and fine tune. So I can fine tune up to 50 cents and -50 cents from the starting note. Let's just go and just move things about a little bit. This is much easier to do with percussion samples because they aren't necessarily overly tuned. But again, we don't want to go too far with all of this. And just a little bit here and there can give a little bit of additional sonic variation. And I'll leave that last one untouched. Have a listen here. So we did some automation, as you can see here. We can also do some more strict modulation with modulation effects if we want to add a little bit of extra movement. For example, we could use some subtle tremolo, or for example, the LFO tool from Extra Records on the hats, for example, just to give a little bit of movement to them. So this effectively acts like a tremolo control, and it is tied to the rate of the session. So we have a rate of a quarter note here. We can actually change that to, say, a half note. This is being a little finicky. And we could do something similar, I guess, on the drum if I open up the mixer. So I can actually bring up the volume a little bit on that extra upbeat there. Right there. Again, just a little something to add some movement, some variety. And then we also have a bunch of different modulation effects to choose from. Not that they would necessarily be appropriate for our samples, but they are available. So a flanger, for example, I would typically have this mix very low and the feedback down, but it will add a little bit of variation to the sound. We can have a listen here. I'll keep the rate relatively low. That's given some stereo information there too, so not what I would use on a snare. And I'm still latching here, so let's actually go to flanger intensity. Make that steady. I'll actually just go to read for now, and I will keep the rate at 1.4. The effect itself, because it is a modulation effect, will add movement to the signal without me having to automate it. If I really wanted to hone this in, I could bring the mix way up and the feedback way up. Again, not something that I would necessarily utilize, but it is an option there if we would like to add a little bit more movement automatically with modulation. So I'll actually turn this off, but I will leave the flanger there for the rest of the video. Another technique that I have for adding sonic variety to the samples in my mix, particularly for percussion samples and transient samples, is actually to go back to automation and, in this case, automate a transient shaper. And so if I go to the hats, for example, I can open up the Plugin Alliance SPL Transient Designer Plus. This is a pretty simple one. We've got an attack control, a sustain control, and then a parallel mix right here, along with some sidechain and output stuff over here. But I'm just going to focus on the attack and sustain for this video. And what I can do is go over here, go latch, and automate this over time. So I really cranked up the attack at the end, and then I can go through another pass and mess about with the sustain here. That attack is a little too much at the end, but you heard that it definitely gave some sonic variation. Let's just go up maybe 10 and have a listen back here. And maybe I'll do something similar on the snare drum as well. Again, this is coming through a sampler, but I can still add effects after it. And let's go latch right here. I will just read the hats for now. I do have a video going into detail about automation and using it in our mixes and music production. I'll leave a link to that one in the description box down below if you're interested in checking it out. And let's automate some parameters here. So we'll start at 0 in the sustain and attack and go from there. So much like the hats, I wanted to drive it up toward the end, and now we can have a look at the sustain. And now if we have a listen back to this, I will actually go in here and duplicate the snare. Bring this down, make sure that that is on read. Get rid of all of these effects right here. Drag that over so that we can have an A-B back-to-back of what just the stock sounds are like without any of the techniques I talked about versus the variation we get with the techniques that I talked about. So we will do no variation first, and then I will loop that back so that we can hear the result of what we've done with the techniques I've shown us. So just want to make sure in this that there's nothing going on here. I will bring that down and have a listen here. And with variation. So I hope you heard how much more variation there was there in this section versus this section. Again, I'm trying to keep things simple and just show you the general techniques. These can apply to whatever it is you're using, whether you're using toms or kick drums or vocal samples or synth samples or whatever it may be, just to help add a little bit more variation to your samples and to make more interesting results in your music production endeavors. So I would encourage you to try out any and all of these strategies for yourself if you're feeling like your samples are lacking a little bit of variety in your mixes, and let me know how it goes in the comments down below. Okay, that's all I've got for you inside Logic Pro today. All right, I hope that these techniques prove useful for you and your samples in your mixes and music production endeavors. I personally use them all the time and rely heavily on samples in my own music, so I'm glad that I was able to share them with you here today. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. You can click that, sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send it to you right away. It will help you make the right decisions at the right times from start to finish throughout the mix to help you improve your mixes. And if you like the way I put together these videos and explain music production and mixing topics, I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button for more information here on YouTube. It greatly helps out small channels like this. And if you'd like to hang out with me more here on YouTube, there's another few videos. I put one in the top left in the top right corner that I think you might like checking out. So I hope to see you in one of my videos soon. Cheers.